Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that the most dangerous enemy you've ever had has been living quietly inside you all along, guiding your decisions, whispering subtle instructions, making you stumble in places you should have soared, and holding you back from doors you were meant to walk through. Imagine thinking every misstep, every lost opportunity, every self-inflicted wound was merely bad luck or poor timing, only to discover that it was you, or rather, something within you that you've never truly met. This force doesn't look like the villain you picture in your nightmares. It looks like your own reflection, only slightly distorted, like a face seen through a rippling pool of water. What if every time you sabotaged your own progress, avoiding a chance you secretly longed for, destroying a relationship you claimed to cherish, undercutting your own talent at the moment you were about to succeed, it wasn't just fear or mistake, but an entire hidden architecture of your psyche, centuries in the making, acting itself out through you. If you've ever wondered why you say one thing and do another, why you dream of change but cling to the familiar pain, why you feel drawn to what harms you and repelled by what might heal you, then you've already brushed against this shadow. Carl Jung called it the shadow, but the word is deceptively simple. A shadow is not just darkness but also shape, movement, and direction. It's the part of you that you don't want to see, and yet it follows you everywhere, sometimes trailing silently, other times surging ahead to block your path. It contains impulses you deny, memories you repress, and potentials you never dared to claim. Most people imagine the shadow as purely negative, anger, envy, lust, but it also hides your unclaimed power, your abandoned creativity, your rejected courage. It's the collection of everything you've pushed into the basement of your consciousness because the surface you needed to appear acceptable, safe, or lovable. Now imagine that this shadow isn't content to stay in the basement. It leaks out in your choices, your habits, your accidents. Every time you tell yourself, "I don't know why I did that," or "I guess I just got unlucky," your shadow may be smiling. Have you noticed how often you self-sabotage at precisely the moment things are about to go right? The job interview you were fully prepared for but somehow arrived late to. The healthy habit you maintained for weeks but abandoned on the very day you needed it most. The friend or partner you pushed away with a careless remark you didn't mean. Could it be that your unconscious is not a passive warehouse of forgotten things, but an active playwright scripting scenes in which you repeatedly stumble because stumbling protects you from something you fear even more: success, intimacy, exposure, transformation? What if your so-called bad luck is actually a hidden form of loyalty to old wounds, to ancestral patterns, to the familiar cage of your own limited self-image? This paradox, that you can be both victim and perpetrator of your own life story, is unsettling because it dissolves the comforting boundary between me and my circumstances. It forces you to ask, if I am not fully in control of my actions, who or what inside me is? And if part of me wants to grow but another part keeps pulling me back, which one is the real me? Is the self you present to the world just a thin crust over a deeper, more chaotic interior? And if so, what would happen if you met that interior self directly? Would you collapse, or would you finally become whole? Jung believed that the greatest danger in life is not some external enemy, but the split within your own psyche. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. That single sentence is like a key hidden under the mat of your everyday existence. What if your fate is nothing more than the sum of unconscious patterns you've refused to face? What if your greatest acts of sabotage are actually attempts by your psyche to draw your attention to what you've disowned? Consider this: a seed cannot grow unless the hard shell cracks open. But from the seed's point of view, the cracking feels like destruction. Is it possible that your self-sabotage is not simply destruction, but a dark and clumsy attempt at growth? A way your shadow tries to force you into awareness, even if it has to hurt you to do it. And if that's true, then your hidden enemy is also your hidden teacher. Yet how do you tell the difference between an inner saboteur and an inner guide? Between what must be resisted and what must be embraced? These questions are not comfortable. They are not meant to be. They're meant to shake the foundation of the story you've been telling yourself, that you're a rational agent making rational choices in a rational world. What if you are instead a living paradox, a being whose deepest drives are unknown even to yourself? And if you don't know them, how can you say you are truly free? The realization is unsettling, but it also holds a strange promise. If you dare to look into the dark mirror, you might find not a monster, but a map. You stand at the threshold of that mirror now, feeling both curiosity and dread. On the other side lies the hidden problem, the psychological and philosophical roots of your self-sabotage, the ancient mechanisms of the shadow that shape your behavior without your consent. Step closer, and you will begin to see how deep the rabbit hole goes. Shall we look? Step closer to that mirror, and you begin to see shapes forming in the darkness, images flickering like old film reels, scenes from your past that you thought you had forgotten, but which still breathe under the floorboards of your consciousness. This is not simply nostalgia or memory, it is the architecture of the self you built to survive. Every child is born as a raw bundle of instincts, impulses, curiosities. Then comes the world with its rules, its judgments, its silent expectations. Piece by piece you learned which parts of you were rewarded and which were punished, which impulses were acceptable and which were bad. You didn't decide these things, they were decided for you by parents, teachers, cultures, and entire centuries of inherited fears. So, you adapted. You pruned yourself like a tree in winter, cutting off branches that threatened to grow the wrong way. Those cut branches didn't die. They simply sank underground, their roots tangling together in the soil of your unconscious. Jung called this the shadow, but it might be more accurate to call it the underground forest of your psyche. It doesn't just store your shame and anger, it also stores your vitality, your spontaneity, your forbidden hopes. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer once wrote that man can do what he wills, but cannot will what he wills. That sentence is like a thunderclap over the illusion of freedom. You can choose between options, yes, but you cannot choose the desires that gave rise to those options. Where do those desires come from? From your unconscious drives, your conditioning, your shadow. This is why you can vow to change and yet relapse, promise to yourself you'll act differently, and yet repeat the old pattern. You are like a ship steering with a tiny rudder while an unseen current pushes you beneath the surface. And yet, because you identify with the captain on deck, you believe you're in control. Jung, Nietzsche, and later Sartre all warned about this hidden determinism. Nietzsche saw it as a call to create yourself anew, to give style to your character. Sartre saw it as the nausea of freedom, the vertigo of realizing you are condemned to choose without a stable censure. Jung saw it as the unfinished work of individuation, the process of integrating the shadow so you can become a whole person rather than a fractured persona. Why does self-sabotage appear at the moment of opportunity? Because opportunity threatens the fragile identity you've built. Success would require you to expand, to show more of yourself, to risk being fully seen. If your unconscious has been taught that exposure equals danger, then it will sabotage you to keep you safe. This is not irrationality. It's a grim kind of logic. Your psyche would rather maintain a painful stability than risk an unknown freedom. Imagine a prisoner who has memorized every inch of his cell, who knows exactly when the guard walks by, who has etched his own calendar into the wall. One day the door is left ajar. Freedom beckons, but he hesitates. Beyond the door is chaos, uncertainty, new demands. Inside the cell is misery, but it's familiar misery. How many times in your own life have you done the same? Hesitated at the threshold, turned back to the familiar pain, because the unfamiliar possibility felt too overwhelming. Viktor Frankl, who survived the camps of Auschwitz, wrote that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the freedom to choose his attitude in any given circumstance. Yet even Frankl acknowledged how difficult that freedom is. It requires you to confront your own inner machinery, the hidden beliefs, the automatic stories, the unexamined fears. Most people never do. They spend their lives in what Aldous Huxley called the door of perception closed, wandering in a self-created fog. They blame fate, luck, or other people for what their own unconscious is orchestrating. They keep rearranging the furniture of their lives without noticing the blueprint they're following was drawn by someone else decades ago. This is the hidden problem. The self you call I is not a single entity, but a parliament of conflicting voices, most of them unconscious. Freud glimpsed it with his id, ego, and superego. Jung mapped it further with arc, he-types, the universal patterns of the collective unconscious that shape your personal story. When you sabotage yourself, it is often an archetype acting through you. The frightened child, the self-punishing martyr, the restless trickster. You can dismiss these as metaphors, but neuroscientists now confirm what the old philosophers intuited. The conscious mind is only a thin sliver of neural activity, while vast networks of implicit memory and emotion fire below awareness, biasing every decision you make. You think you are reasoning, you are often rationalizing. You think you are choosing, you are often replaying. Even your highest ideals can serve the shadow. You tell yourself you're a perfectionist because you have high standards, but perhaps perfectionism protects you from the risk of completion, which would invite criticism. You tell yourself you're being realistic, but perhaps you're simply afraid to imagine more. You call it humility when you shrink from opportunity, but perhaps it's self-neglect. In this way, your shadow wears masks even as it lives in the dark. To see it clearly requires an act of almost unbearable honesty. Nietzsche said that no one lies as much as the indignant man, but perhaps no one lies as much as the unconscious self, to itself. Here lies the paradox. The part of you that sabotages is also the part of you that longs for healing. The shadow contains not only what you fear, but what you need. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." In other words, your wholeness is not somewhere above you, like a star you must reach. It's below you, in the underground forest you've avoided. You don't transcend your shadow by ignoring it. You transcend it by descending into it and reclaiming what's yours. And yet, even as you begin to understand this hidden architecture, another pause. A question arises. What happens when these buried forces start to leak into your everyday life, not just in small self-sabotages, but in the very fabric of your relationships, your society, your culture? If the shadow of an individual can direct a life without consent, what about the shadow of a nation, a civilization, an entire age? Perhaps your personal sabotage is just a microcosm of something larger, a hidden tide moving through all of us. You are beginning to sense that this is not just a private psychological quirk, but a collective inheritance woven into how we live, work, and dream. But how far does it go? And what are the consequences when this hidden force spills out of the psyche and into the world you inhabit? Imagine now that the shadow you've begun to glimpse inside yourself is not only personal, but collective, a vast undercurrent flowing beneath the surface of society. What if every institution you interact with, schools, workplaces, governments, is also shaped by its own unconscious drives, repressed fears, and unacknowledged desires? If an individual can sabotage themselves, can a culture sabotage its own progress? Look around. Entire civilizations rise on ideals of freedom and equality only to build systems of control and hierarchy. Communities celebrate compassion and then stigmatize vulnerability. Companies claim innovation but punish dissent. These contradictions are not random. They are the collective shadow at work, acting out what is repressed on a larger stage. When Jung visited America, he remarked that it was a nation of brilliant technological progress, but childlike in its moral self-awareness, a country in love with the image of itself, but uneasy with its own darkness. He could just as well have been speaking of any society at any time. On the personal level, the unseen consequences of your shadow's influence can be subtle yet devastating. It can shape whom you're drawn to in love, gravitating toward partners who mirror your wounds rather than your hopes. It can influence your career choices, unconsciously avoiding paths that would demand you stand in your full power. It can even affect your health, as stress and self-neglect accumulate from living a life misaligned with your deeper self. You may appear successful to others, but inside you feel like an imposter waiting for the collapse. Or you may sabotage every step toward success because success would require you to become someone you've never been allowed to be. In this way, self-sabotage is not a single event, but a slow erosion of possibility. Like water wearing down stone, it reshapes your destiny grain by grain. Neurology gives this a concrete explanation. The amygdala, that almond-shaped cluster deep in your brain, does not differentiate between physical threat and psychological risk. If you were humiliated for speaking up as a child, your amygdala stored that as danger. Decades later, a chance to speak your truth at work or in a relationship can trigger the same circuitry. You'll feel anxiety, freeze, procrastinate, forget to send the email, tell yourself it's not the right time. Consciously, you believe you're making a rational choice. Unconsciously, you're obeying a survival reflex that no longer fits your life. Multiply this across dozens of situations, and you see how a person can live an entire lifetime inside a pattern built to protect a child who no longer exists. Cognitive biases amplify this trap. Confirmation bias makes you notice evidence that your fears were right and ignore evidence to the contrary. The self-serving bias lets you blame circumstances when things go wrong, preserving the illusion that you're not complicit in your own patterns. Learned helplessness convinces you that change is impossible even when the door is open. All of these are psychological shortcuts evolved to save energy and ensure survival, but in modern life, they keep you circling the same closed loop. You are not lazy or weak. You are entangled in a system of neural habits and cultural scripts that have never been brought into consciousness. And because you don't see it, you may mistake your shadow's actions for moral failings. You berate yourself for lacking discipline or courage when in fact your psyche is enacting an old strategy. This shame then becomes another layer of sabotage. You hide your struggle from others, presenting a curated self to the world while your real self withers. The more you hide, the more the shadow grows. The more it grows, the more it erupts in symptoms: depression, anxiety, self-destructive choices, emotional numbness. Each symptom is a signal flare from the unconscious saying, "Look here, something has been lost." But because we live in a culture that medicates symptoms and worships productivity, you may suppress the flare instead of following it. Thus the cycle continues. This isn't just about individual pain, it's about lost potential. Think of all the art never created, the innovations never attempted, the kindnesses never given because people were trapped in self-sabotage. Think of how many leaders, teachers, parents have acted out their unresolved shadows on others, perpetuating harm across generations. When a society punishes vulnerability, it produces leaders who cannot admit mistakes. When a family stigmatizes emotion, it raises children who cannot feel their own needs. Each unacknowledged shadow spawns 1,000 smaller ones, like a fractal of hidden pain. You inherit not only your parents' eye color, but their unspoken fears, their unfinished grief, their unclaimed strengths. Epigenetics even shows that trauma can leave chemical marks on DNA, predisposing descendants to heightened stress responses. The shadow is not just psychological, it's biological, historical, ancestral. Once you see this, the everyday world begins to look different. The news stops feeling like a series of disconnected events and more like a collective dream, with archetypes playing out on a global stage. The scapegoating of outsiders reflects the shadow of national identity. The obsession with celebrity reflects the shadow of unlived personal potential. Even technological addictions, scrolling, binge-watching, compulsive checking, can be seen as attempts to avoid sitting with one's own unconscious material. You are not just living in your shadow, you are swimming in an ocean of collective shadow every time you open your eyes. This realization can feel overwhelming. If the problem is so vast, what can you possibly do? But before leaping to solutions, notice what is happening inside you as you read this. Perhaps a flicker of recognition, perhaps defensiveness, perhaps a sense of relief that your self-sabotage is not pure madness, but a kind of misdirected wisdom. All of these are signals that your unconscious is stirring. The curtain is lifting on the stage where your inner archetypes have been performing. For the first time, you may glimpse the strings, yet knowledge alone does not free you. You can read 1,000 books about the shadow and still act out its script tomorrow. What begins to free you is a different quality of attention, one that neither condemns nor excuses, but simply witnesses. As Jung wrote, "We cannot change anything until we accept it." Condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses. To accept is not to approve, but to include. You begin by including in your awareness what you've excluded from your identity. That's when the shadow starts to lose its grip. But this acceptance is not passive. It is an act of rebellion. It challenges the deepest conditioning of your psyche and your culture. It means walking out of the familiar cell even when the open door leads into darkness. It means daring to become someone your old self-sabotaging patterns would find unrecognizable. Are you willing to do that? Are you willing to see that the enemy and the teacher inside you are the same? Because only then can you move from unconscious sabotage to conscious transformation. We stand now on the edge of that possibility, the rebellion against your inner saboteur, the act of breaking free from the patterns that have silently directed your life. In the next section, we will step into that rebellion, not as a theoretical idea, but as a living shift in perspective, a counterintuitive path toward reclaiming what was always yours. Imagine for a moment that you are standing inside a labyrinth whose walls are made of your own habits, fears, and forgotten dreams. For years you have walked its corridors, thinking they were the whole world. Sometimes you sprint forward, sometimes you stumble, sometimes you sit in despair at a dead end, but always you stay within the labyrinth. Then one day, almost by accident, you place your hand on the wall and feel that it's not stone but paper, and with one push you could tear it down. That is the moment of rebellion against your own shadow, the recognition that the prison you've been living in is largely of your own making, and the key has been in your hand all along. This recognition is not gentle. It can feel like an earthquake, like losing your old self before knowing what new self will emerge. But in that collapse lies the chance for freedom. To break free from self-sabotage, you cannot simply try harder or be positive. Those strategies are like rearranging furniture inside the cell. Real rebellion begins with turning toward what you've been avoiding, your shadow, instead of running from it. This means cultivating what Jung called active imagination, a dialogue with the parts of yourself you've disowned. You might begin by noticing patterns without judgment, by writing them down, by speaking to them as if they were characters in a story. This isn't childish fantasy, it's a way of giving form to what has been formless. When you meet an inner critic, you ask what it's protecting you from. When you encounter procrastination, you ask what risk it's trying to avoid. Slowly you learn that each saboteur is also a guardian, holding a piece of your power that you once gave up. The philosopher Nietzsche urged each person to become who you are. It sounds paradoxical. How can you become what you already are? But the point is that your true self is not the narrow persona you present, but the totality of your being, including the shadow. To become who you are is to integrate, not to perfect. It is to take back the energies you projected onto others, your unacknowledged anger, your hidden talents, your forbidden joy, and claim them as your own. This process is unsettling because it dissolves the excuses you've lived by. You can no longer say, "I'm just unlucky," or "this is just who I am." You begin to see that even your limitations are choices, and that realization can feel like both liberation and terror. Rebellion also requires a shift in how you relate to pain. Up until now, you may have seen pain as an enemy, something to avoid or numb, but pain is often the signal that your shadow is speaking. When you feel the familiar ache of self-sabotage rising, instead of fleeing, you can pause and ask, what is this really about? What am I afraid of if I succeed? What old story am I still obeying? This is not masochism. It is alchemy. You are using discomfort as a guide to hidden truths. Like a miner following a vein of ore, you go where the resistance is, because that's where the treasure lies. Aldous Huxley once said that experience is not what happens to you, it's what you do with what happens to you. In the rebellion against your inner saboteur, experience becomes raw material for transformation. Each setback is a message. Each trigger is an invitation. Even your envy can be a compass, pointing to a quality you've exiled from yourself. This is why comparing yourself to others can be both poisonous and illuminating. When you envy someone's courage, creativity, or freedom, it may be your shadow showing you what you're capable of but haven't allowed. To rebel is to follow those clues, back to their source, and reclaim them. Concrete practices help anchor this rebellion. Mindfulness meditation trains you to watch your thoughts without fusing with them, giving you a gap in which to choose differently. Journaling exposes patterns on paper so they lose their power to operate in secret. Therapy or honest conversation with a trusted friend can mirror your blind spots back to you. Even physical practices, breathwork, movement, spending time in nature, can loosen the grip of old neural circuits and make space for new ones. These are not quick fixes. They are acts of daily defiance against the inertia of your unconscious. Each time you pause before reacting, each time you name a pattern instead of enacting it, you are walking out of the labyrinth one step at a time. But rebellion is not only inner work. Because the shadow is also collective, breaking free may require you to question the roles and systems you've been living inside. Do your friendships support your growth or reinforce your self-sabotage? Does your work align with your values or numb your awareness? Do your cultural narratives about success, love, gender, power feed your shadow or integrate it? Sometimes the most radical act is to leave a situation that keeps you small, even if it means facing uncertainty. This too is a kind of death, the death of the persona you've worn to survive. But as every myth and initiation story shows, the descent into darkness is followed by rebirth. Viktor Frankl observed that those who survived the camps were often those who could find meaning even in suffering. Meaning is what transforms pain into growth. In your own life, meaning emerges when you see your self-sabotage not as proof of your brokenness, but as evidence of your psyche's attempt to keep you safe. You can thank it for its service and then release it from its outdated duty. This reframes rebellion from an act of violence against yourself to an act of reconciliation. You're not trying to kill your shadow, but to integrate it so it no longer needs to act out. The poet Rilke wrote, "Perhaps everything terrible is in its deepest being something helpless that wants help from us." Your inner saboteur is not a demon, but a neglected child, a frightened protector, a cast-off part of your soul. Rebellion, then, is really a return. It's the act of bringing home what you've exiled. It's counterintuitive because it feels like moving toward what you most fear. But only by doing so can you dissolve the split that keeps you sabotaging yourself. And as you practice this, something unexpected happens. The labyrinth walls begin to thin. Opportunities arise and you don't flinch. You speak and your voice doesn't shake. You feel the old impulse to pull back, but you choose to step forward anyway. Each time you do, the shadow loses another inch of territory. This is not a single victory, but an ongoing revolution, a slow reclaiming of your life from the autopilot of the unconscious. Standing at this threshold, you can sense that another, deeper layer awaits, the ultimate truth hidden behind the shadow, the revelation that makes sense of all the struggle. If rebellion is the path, then what lies at the destination? What is the final, most powerful realization that emerges when the shadow is not just integrated, but understood? The final, most powerful realization. Imagine the moment when, after years of circling the labyrinth, after countless encounters with your inner saboteurs, after facing and integrating each fragment of your shadow, you step into a space that feels eerily quiet. The walls are gone. The air is still. There is no longer a fight with yourself, because there is no longer a split self to fight. What you experience in that moment is not victory in the conventional sense. It's not a burst of joy or a grand finale. It's more like a homecoming to a place you didn't know you'd left. This is the ultimate truth that Jung hinted at, the realization that the shadow is,